Good evening. Many are still trying to process the events of the past 72 hours in the Strait of Hormuz, interpreting them as another escalation in a familiar cycle of regional tensions. But what we witnessed was not a gradual realignment of power, nor a negotiated adjustment to existing realities. This was a deliberate, coordinated, and devastatingly executed demonstration of what happens when a resurgent great power provides full-spectrum backing to a regional ally at the precise moment that ally chooses to close the world's most critical energy chokepoint. From the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin publicly announced Russia's complete support for Iranian sovereignty and regional security operations, a statement delivered with a clarity that left no room for diplomatic interpretation. Within 6 hours of that declaration, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps launched 1,200 ballistic and cruise missiles in a coordinated strike package. This assault targeted every naval and commercial vessel transiting the Strait of Hormuz, every shore facility supporting maritime traffic through the strait, and critically, the American carrier strike group that had been repositioned into the Gulf of Oman specifically to deter precisely this kind of action. The USS Gerald R. the newest, most technologically advanced, and most expensive warship ever constructed by any nation in human history, absorbed multiple missile impacts that have rendered it non-operational as a combat platform. Early damage assessments suggest the vessel will require dockyard repairs measured in years, not months. This projected repair timeline is unprecedented for a capital ship of the Ford's class in a conflict not involving peer-on-peer global warfare. It signals a new, profound vulnerability for even the most advanced naval assets, challenging long-held assumptions about the survivability of carrier strike groups in contested environments. In Tel Aviv, the Israeli government watched the destruction of American naval power in the Gulf unfold in real time. They are now confronting a reality their entire strategic posture had been constructed to avoid. Without American carrier presence in the region, without the implicit threat of American air power that presence represents, and without the resupply lines that flow through the now-closed Strait of Hormuz, Israel is operationally isolated in a way it has not been since the earliest days of its existence. The word abandon is not diplomatic language. It is the accurate description of Israel's current strategic position. Washington did not choose to abandon its ally. It was forced by circumstances it could not control to accept a reality it could not prevent. Now let's break this down completely. In the breakdown that follows, we will work through the strategic questions that are being urgently processed in every defense ministry and foreign office that matters. How did 1,200 missiles penetrate the defensive architecture of a carrier strike group specifically designed to survive exactly this category of threat? And what does the Ford's effective elimination as a combat platform mean for American naval power projection globally? What is Putin actually signaling through his explicit backing of Iran at precisely this moment? And how does Russian strategic calculus benefit from an American carrier strike group burning in the Gulf? Why has Washington been forced into a position where it must choose between escalation that risks direct confrontation with Russia and withdrawal that abandons Israel? And what does that choice reveal about the true limits of American power in a multipolar environment? And when the dust settles and the Ford limps into port, who controls the Middle East? And what does the international order look like when American carrier dominance has been demonstrably defeated? From a professional military standpoint, what Iran executed in the Strait of Hormuz represents the most sophisticated anti-access strike campaign ever conducted against a defended high-value naval target. This was not a desperate salvo hoping to achieve a lucky hit. This was a meticulously planned, multi-axis, layered strike architecture designed to systematically overwhelm every defensive layer of the carrier strike group through sequence saturation, decoy employment, and terminal phase maneuvering that the defending systems could not counter. The strike package was organized into 5 distinct waves, each with a specific tactical objective within the broader operational design. The first wave, approximately 300 older generation anti-ship cruise missiles, including the indigenous Iranian Nure and Carter systems, was launched from coastal positions along the northern shore of the strait. These weapons are subsonic, relatively easy to detect, and within the engagement envelope of the carrier group's SM-2 and evolved Sea Sparrow defensive missiles. Their purpose was not to penetrate and hit. Their purpose was to force the defending systems to reveal their positions, expend interceptors, and establish firing patterns that could be analyzed in real time for the waves that followed. The second wave, approximately 250 weapons, launched 20 minutes after the first, introduced a significantly more complex threat. This wave combined Iranian-produced cruise missiles with initial tranche Russian caliber systems, flying at mixed altitudes and speeds, designed to complicate the fire control solution for the defending ships. Some weapons flew high and fast to draw defensive attention upward. Others flew sea-skimming profiles at wave-top height, using the radar clutter from the ocean's surface to mask their approach until they were within the horizon range, where intercept time compresses to seconds. The defending Aegis combat system aboard the escort cruisers and destroyers was now processing target streams from multiple vectors simultaneously, with different threat profiles requiring different intercept geometries. The third wave was the inflection point. Approximately 400 missiles, including the Iranian Khyber Sheikh and confirmed Russian Khyber M variants, were launched in a compressed time window designed to arrive over the target area simultaneously. This created the saturation condition that every anti-access doctrine aims to achieve: more simultaneous threats than the defending system has ready interceptors to engage, compressing the decision cycle to a point where human operators can no longer maintain effective control, and automated systems begin making engagement priority decisions that inevitably allow some percentage of the incoming threat to penetrate unengaged. The fourth wave introduced the weapons that ultimately achieved the mission kill hits on the Ford. Approximately 150 hypersonic anti-ship missiles, a combination of the Iranian Fateh-2 and what imagery analysis strongly suggests were Russian Zircon systems or close derivatives, were launched after the defensive system had been degraded by 3 waves of sustained engagement. These weapons travel at velocities between Mach 8 and Mach 9 in their terminal phase, maneuver unpredictably in the final seconds of flight, and present an engagement problem that the SM-6 Interceptor, the most capable anti-air missile in the American inventory, is only marginally capable of addressing under ideal conditions. Under the degraded, saturated defensive conditions that the first 3 waves had created, the SM-6 batteries were achieving intercept rates well below the threshold required to prevent penetration. This performance gap in the SM-6, America's premier air defense missile, against advanced hypersonic threats, even under saturated conditions, reveals a critical vulnerability. It suggests that the long-anticipated shift in the offense-defense balance, where even advanced defenses struggle against overwhelming, sophisticated attacks, has now definitively arrived, with profound implications for naval power projection. In the fifth wave, approximately 100 additional hypersonic weapons held in reserve were employed against targets identified during the execution of the first 4 waves as requiring follow-on engagement. This demonstrated a level of real-time battle management and strike coordination that reflects genuine operational sophistication at the highest level of modern naval warfare. The damage to the Ford specifically reflects the characteristics of hypersonic weapons' impacts. The flight deck absorbed at least 3 confirmed hits from weapons whose kinetic energy at impact velocities exceeding Mach 8 is sufficient to defeat the structural hardening of a carrier deck, even without the warhead detonating. The resulting craters and structural compromise have rendered catapult systems inoperable and arrested the ability to conduct fixed-wing flight operations. Secondary fires from ruptured fuel lines compounded the damage before damage control teams could achieve containment. The casualty count remains officially classified, but informed assessments place it in the range that makes this the single most lethal day for American naval personnel since World War II. What I find most operationally significant is not just the scale of the strike, but the evidence it provides about the depth of Iranian preparation and the degree to which Russian technical support had been integrated into that preparation. Well before the strike itself, the mission planning software required to coordinate 1,200 weapons across 5 waves, managing deconfliction, timing, and sequencing against a maneuvering target defended by the most capable air defense systems afloat. That software does not get written in a matter of days. The training of Iranian operators on the specific employment characteristics of Russian-supplied hypersonic systems does not happen overnight. What we witnessed in the Strait was the operational fruit of a strategic partnership that had been building for years, executed at a moment when its demonstration would have maximum strategic effect. Understanding why Vladimir Putin chose this moment to provide explicit backing to an Iranian operation that he knew would result in direct kinetic action against American naval forces requires understanding how Russian strategic thinking has evolved in response to 30 years of post-Cold War experience with the United States and its alliance system. From Moscow's perspective, and I say this as someone who has studied Russian strategic culture and spoken extensively with Russian military professionals, the fundamental driver of Russian foreign policy since the NATO expansion decisions of the 1990s has been the conviction that the United States does not and will not accept Russia as a legitimate great power, with its own sphere of influence and its own security interests that must be accommodated in the international system. Every interaction, every negotiation, every crisis has reinforced that conviction. The result has been a Russian strategic posture that prioritizes building the capability to impose costs on American power projection that exceed what Washington is willing to pay. The Iranian relationship is central to that strategy because Iran occupies geography and possesses capabilities that create structural problems for American force projection in a region where American commitments are both deep and difficult to sustain. The Strait of Hormuz is a chokepoint through which 20% of global oil trade flows daily. Iran's missile and drone arsenal presents an anti-access threat that no amount of American naval power can fully neutralize without accepting casualties at a level that's where American domestic politics cannot absorb. And Iran's demonstrated willingness to escalate when its core interests are threatened creates a permanent source of strategic leverage over American decision-making. Putin's explicit statement that Russian national interests are tied to Iranian security was not rhetorical flourish. It was a deliberate signal to Washington that any American military operation designed to fundamentally degrade Iranian capability, the kind of sustained air campaign that Pentagon planners have, war-gamed for decades, would be understood in Moscow as a direct threat to Russian interests and would be met with Russian countermeasures. What those countermeasures might be was left deliberately ambiguous. But the ambiguity itself serves a deterrent function by forcing American planners to account for potential Russian actions that could range from advanced weapons transfers to direct Russian military involvement. The timing of the strike reflects Russian assessment that the current American domestic political environment, combined with the strategic overextension of American forces across multiple simultaneous commitments, creates a window where Washington's response options are constrained in ways that would not have been true 5 years ago or might not be true 5 years hence. American forces are deployed in support of operations in multiple theaters, and the American defense industrial base is struggling to keep pace with the munitions consumption rates that current conflicts are generating. And the American domestic political debate on foreign policy is increasingly divided between those who want continued global engagement and those who want strategic retrenchment. In that environment, the cost of escalating in response to the Ford strike, particularly when that escalation risks widening the conflict to include direct confrontation with Russia, is higher than it would be under different conditions. From Putin's standpoint, the operational result validates the strategic logic. The Ford is combat ineffective. American carrier aviation, the primary instrument of American offensive power projection in the region, has been withdrawn from the operational theater. Israel, observing this withdrawal, has been forced to confront the reality that American military support has limits that are defined not by declared commitments, but by operational risk calculations that can change. And the entire international community has received a demonstration that American naval power, while formidable, is not invulnerable when confronted by a determined adversary employing modern anti-ship weapons in an environment where geography favors the defender. The strategic message is clear. The era of uncontested American military dominance, where the appearance of an American carrier group was sufficient to alter the behavior of regional actors, is over. The new era is multipolar, contested, and significantly more dangerous for American forces that venture into regions where peer and near-peer competitors have decided to make a stand. Having observed American national security decision-making from inside the system, I can tell you that what the Ford strike has created for Washington is the category of strategic problem that has no good solution. Only choices between different categories of bad outcomes, each carrying consequences that extend far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The escalation pathway, the option that involves direct American military strikes against Iranian missile launch sites, command and control nodes, and the logistical infrastructure supporting Iran's anti-ship capability, is the option that preserves American credibility in the most immediate sense. It demonstrates that attacks on American forces carry consequences, and that the United States will not absorb such attacks without responding forcefully. But the costs of that escalation are severe and multidimensional. First, the military execution of a sustained air campaign against Iran's dispersed and hardened missile infrastructure would require weeks of continuous operations, thousands of sorties, and the acceptance of aircraft losses in an air defense environment that is significantly more capable than any that the American military has operated against since Vietnam. Iran's integrated air defense network combines Russian-supplied S-300 systems with indigenous developments including the Bavar 373, which has demonstrated engagement capabilities against targets that the older systems Iran possesses cannot address. American stealth aircraft, F-22s and F-35s, can reduce but not eliminate the threat, and attrition rates would climb as the campaign progressed and Iranian defenders adapted. Second, Iran's response to such an American campaign would almost certainly include closure of the Strait of Hormuz through a combination of mining, continued anti-ship missile attacks against any vessel attempting passage, and potential direct strikes against oil production and export facilities across the Gulf states. The resulting oil price shock would be immediate, severe, and sustained for the duration of the conflict. Global oil prices exceeding $200 per barrel are not unrealistic in such a scenario, with corresponding economic consequences that would be felt in every major economy within weeks. Third, and this is the dimension that makes escalation genuinely dangerous rather than merely costly, there is no certainty that escalation stops with an American air campaign against Iranian targets. Putin's explicit statement tying Russian interests to Iranian security was carefully worded, but its implications are clear. If Russia chooses to interpret a sustained American air campaign against Iran as triggering the commitment Putin articulated, Russian countermeasures could range from direct military aid to Iran during the campaign to Russian operations in other theaters designed to impose costs on American interests where American forces are more vulnerable. The risk of an American-Russian confrontation escalating beyond the boundaries that both sides can control is not theoretical in such a scenario. The alternative pathway, strategic disengagement, acceptance of the Ford's effective loss as a price paid for avoiding wider war, and a drawdown of American forward presence in the Gulf, preserves American forces from further immediate risk, but carries its own severe consequences. The abandonment of Israel is not a phrase that any American administration wants associated with its foreign policy. But the operational reality is that without American carrier aviation providing the strike capability that Israel lacks the indigenous capacity to project at the required scale, Israel confronts a threat environment it cannot manage through its own resources alone. The signal that such a withdrawal would send to every American ally and security partner globally would be profound and immediate. If the United States will not sustain its forward presence and protect its closest regional ally when confronted with significant military risk, what value do American security guarantees carry for nations whose geographic circumstances make them equally vulnerable to regional powers that might choose to test American resolve? The credibility loss extends across every theater where American alliance commitments underpin regional stability. In my assessment, Washington is paralyzed not because it lacks the military capability to execute either option, but because both options lead to outcomes that the American political system is not prepared to absorb. Escalation risks a wider war with economic and military costs that could not be sustained politically. Disengagement abandons commitments and allies in a manner that undermines the entire architecture of American global influence. The choices are between two different forms of strategic defeat, and the silence from Washington reflects the difficulty of selecting which form to accept. What I am watching happen in Israeli strategic planning circles right now, through contacts, through open-source reporting, and through the operational indicators visible in IDF force posture changes, is the real-time collapse of the foundational assumption that has structured Israeli national security policy since 1973. That assumption was simple. Regardless of the immediate regional threat environment, the ultimate security of the Israeli state was guaranteed by American military power and American willingness to employ that power to prevent Israel's destruction. The Ford's withdrawal shatters that assumption in a way that no diplomatic statement or policy shift ever could. The operational indicators are stark. The IDF has suspended offensive operations that were being planned against Hezbollah positions in southern Lebanon, not because those operations are no longer militarily necessary, but because executing them without assured American air support carries a risk profile that Israeli planners now assess as unacceptable. The recall of reserve forces that had been demobilized after recent rotation cycles has been suspended, keeping units in the field longer than the planned deployment duration, a measure that reflects uncertainty about whether reinforcements will be available if the security situation deteriorates further. And the diplomatic contacts that Israel has traditionally limited to Western partners have expanded to include indirect channels to Moscow, exploring what terms might be available for Russian-mediated de-escalation with Iran. The psychological dimension of this shift is as significant as the operational dimension. Israeli society has absorbed trauma and sustained conflict across multiple generations, but it has done so with an underlying confidence that when existential threat emerged, American power would arrive to reinforce Israeli capability and restore the security equation. That confidence is evaporating in real time as the Ford withdraws and Washington remains publicly silent about what comes next. The question Israeli leadership now confronts, and this is not hyperbole, is whether the state can survive in an environment where Iranian precision strike capability can reach any target in Israeli territory, where Hezbollah possesses the weapons and the will to sustain high-intensity conflict indefinitely, and where the American military presence that has historically balanced those threats is no longer willing to accept the risks associated with remaining forward deployed in the region. This existential questioning marks a profound departure from Israel's strategic calculus since 1973, where the ultimate guarantee of its survival was implicitly tied to American military power. The current situation forces Israel to reevaluate its core security tenets without the bedrock of assured external intervention, a truly unprecedented challenge. The nuclear dimension of that calculation cannot be ignored, though it must be addressed carefully. Israel possesses a nuclear arsenal whose existence has never been officially acknowledged, but whose presence has been an open secret for 50 years. That arsenal has always served as the ultimate guarantor of Israeli survival, the weapon of last resort that ensures no conventional military defeat can become an existential threat. But the threshold for nuclear use is extraordinarily high, and the consequences of crossing it are irreversible. The question Israeli planners are now working through is whether a security environment that is deteriorating but not yet existentially catastrophic justifies the risks associated with nuclear signaling or employment. My assessment is that we are not at that threshold yet, but the distance to it is shorter than it has been at any point since 1973. My honest assessment, and I offer this as someone who has spent a career studying how regional orders form, stabilize, and collapse, is that we are watching the end of the American organized Middle Eastern security architecture, and the beginning of something fundamentally different, whose final form will take years to stabilize, but whose basic structure is already becoming visible. The core organizing principle of the emerging order is not ideological alignment or democratic values. It is the balance of military capability combined with geographic position. Iran, positioned at the center of the region with the ability to threaten oil flows through Hormuz, possesses structural leverage that no amount of American offshore presence can eliminate. Without costs, Washington has now demonstrated it will not pay. Russia, positioned as the external great power most willing to provide capabilities that challenge American preferences, gains influence proportional to its willingness to back regional actors against American pressure. China, positioned as the economic partner most willing to ignore American sanctions and maintain commercial relationships regardless of Washington's preferences, gains access and influence in direct proportion to American withdrawal. The Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, are conducting urgent strategic reviews whose outcome will almost certainly involve reduced dependency on exclusive American security guarantees and increased diplomatic and economic engagement with the Iran, Russia, China alignment. That does not mean abandoning relationships with Washington entirely. These states are sophisticated enough to maintain relationships with multiple power centers simultaneously. But it does mean that American preferences will carry less weight in their decision-making than at any point in the past 50 years. For Israel, the emerging order presents a set of options that are all dramatically worse than the status quo of the past 3 decades. Accommodation with Iran through Russian or Chinese mediation would require concessions on nuclear program constraints and regional influence that no current Israeli government could accept domestically. Continued confrontation without assured American backing means operating in a permanently heightened threat environment with no clear pathway to resolution. And withdrawal into a defensive crouch focused purely on territorial defense means abandoning the forward deployed security posture that has been the foundation of Israeli military strategy since 1967. The energy dimension of the new order will reshape global markets in ways that no diplomatic initiative can prevent. If Iran demonstrates the sustained ability to threaten or interdict Hormuz traffic whenever its core interests are challenged, the risk premium built into oil pricing becomes structural rather than temporary. Energy importers, which includes virtually every major economy, will be forced to diversify supply chains, build strategic reserves, and accept price volatility at levels that will constrain economic growth for years. But the economic consequences of that shift will be felt far beyond the Middle East. From my perspective, the most significant shift is not any single operational event, but the cumulative demonstration that American military power, while still formidable in absolute terms, has limits in its ability to shape outcomes in regions where determined adversaries have decided to contest American presence. The Carrier Strike Group was supposed to be the capability that could not be challenged. The Ford's withdrawal under fire demonstrates that the challenge succeeded. That demonstration will be studied, absorbed, and acted upon by every nation currently assessing its own strategic position relative to American power. The Middle East that emerges from this transition will be more volatile, more contested, and significantly more dangerous than the American organized order it replaces. But it will also be more reflective of the actual distribution of power and will in the region, rather than the distribution that American preferences tried to impose. Whether that produces stability or sustained chaos over the longer term depends on decisions that have not yet been made. What is certain is that American dominance, the organizing principle of the regional order for 3 generations, has ended. And what replaces it is still being written. The USS Gerald R. Ford, a $14 billion vessel, the most advanced carrier ever built, the symbol of American naval supremacy, is withdrawing from the Gulf with its flight deck compromised and its air wing unable to conduct operations. Russia explicitly backed the Iranian operation that put it in that condition. Israel watches American power retreat and confronts a threat environment it cannot manage alone. And in Washington, the silence continues because there is no good option remaining. Only choices between different categories of strategic defeat. In 30 years of watching how great powers operate under pressure, I have never seen a clearer demonstration of the limits of military technology when confronted by strategic will and geographic advantage. The Ford had every defensive system that American engineering could design. It was escorted by cruisers and destroyers, carrying the most advanced air defense missiles in any inventory. It was supported by the full intelligence and surveillance architecture of the United States military, and 1,200 missiles launched by a regional power operating from its own coastline with explicit backing from a great power competitor put it out of action. The question now is not whether American dominance in the Middle East has ended. That question was answered when the Ford began its withdrawal. The question is what Washington does with that reality, how Israel adapts to the sudden absence of the guarantee it structured its entire existence around, and whether the emerging multipolar order produces a new equilibrium or sustained conflict between power centers whose interests cannot be reconciled.